The comfortable K. The nicest prison is still a prison. It just takes longer to find the bars. ISV Cache and Mission Log, Verath Corridor, Solen System, Day 31. Captain R. Maddox, Active Mission File. The science vessel assigned to monitor the Knot Nebula was called the ISV Meridian, and it had arrived in Corridor 9 with the particular energy of a research crew that had been told they were getting a standard atmospheric survey assignment, and had instead found a spatio-temporal anomaly of completely unknown origin sitting in their designated survey zone, like a very large, very violet, very unexplained problem. Their preliminary report, transmitted to the cache 4 days after arrival, used the phrase unprecedented phenomenon 7 times, and we have no idea 0 times, because science reports didn't use that phrase even when it was accurate. Maddox read the report, noted that unprecedented phenomenon, and we have no idea were functionally identical statements dressed in different clothes, and forwarded it to 3 with a personal addendum that said, "Meridian is on station. They're baffled. I assume you are too, sharing data as it comes." 3's response arrived 6 hours later, acknowledged. The data is consistent with our own analysis. The phenomenon remains unclassified. He paused. Maddox had learned to read the rhythm of 3's transmissions the way you learn to read the rhythm of a person's breath, and then added, "The directive has been informed." Maddox had stared at that last line for a while. The directive has been informed, which meant the directive had formed, assessed the Knot Nebula, produced an outcome, and dissolved. And whatever that outcome was, 3 either couldn't or hadn't chosen to share it. Maddox filed this under things to pursue later and turned his attention to the immediate task the ISV program had assigned while the Meridian did its work. First contact, Solen System, adjacent to the Corridor 9 anomaly zone, designated in the program's contact registry as inhabited, technologically advanced, status unclear. Status unclear was program language, for we think something is going on here, but we couldn't confirm it from long range. Given recent experience, Maddox thought, that probably meant it was in Lathium. He was right, and also completely unprepared for what that meant this time. Solen was not Entara. That was the first thing. The second thing was that it was not trying to be anything other than what it was, which was a planet that had clearly been doing very well for itself and wanted you to know about it in the friendliest possible terms. From orbit, the system showed all the Lathian infrastructure signatures, 7 relay towers in geosynchronous arrangement, the orbital logistics platform that indicated a weight had been through, the threadline relay node sitting at the system's L2 point like a piece of very elegant, very silent mail infrastructure. The Lathians had been here. The Lathians were still here, in the administrative sense. But unlike Antara, where the Lathian presence sat on the city like a held breath, Solen's infrastructure integrated with the existing architecture in a way that looked almost natural, as if it had grown alongside rather than been placed on top of. The Soleni had responded to the Cassion's approach signal within 2 hours, a warm, visually rich transmission that the translation matrix rendered with less effort than usual because the Soleni, it turned out, had been in contact with enough other species to have developed a fairly robust general communication framework of their own. The face on the screen had been a woman named Administrator Kale Doran, who was Soleni, meaning she was tall, willowy, with a faint bioluminescent quality to her skin that shifted between amber and pale gold depending on, Maddox would later learn, emotional state. She had looked at Maddox the way people looked at someone who had arrived at a party they hadn't been told about, but were genuinely pleased to see anyway. Earth vessel, she had said, with something that the Matrix tagged as delighted recognition. We've been hoping one of you would come this way. Please come down. We have so much to show you." Maddox had looked at Yara. Yara had looked at Maddox. "Huh," Maddox had said. The Solani city of Vale, the capital, and Cale Doran had not suggested a secondary city, had simply offered the capital with the ease of someone who had nothing to hide about it, was extraordinary. It was built in the Solani's native architectural style, which favored flowing curves and integrated greenery in the way that some species built with stone and others with metal, and it had been expanded. That was the word Maddox kept arriving at. Not replaced, not overwritten, expanded. The Lathian relay towers were there, precise and geometric, but the Solani had grown their architecture around and through them in a way that softened the edges, so that looking at the skyline you saw towers and vines and light panels and the faint luminescent pulse of relay filaments woven into building facades like decorative lighting that happened to also be functional infrastructure. "They made it theirs," Sable said quietly, walking beside Maddox through the main plaza while Cale Doran gave them a tour. Her amber eyes were moving across the cityscape with an expression Maddox had learned to read as her processing something she wasn't sure how to categorize. "Is that good or bad?" Maddox asked, equally quietly. "I don't know yet," Sable said. Cale Doran, who had excellent hearing, said, "Both, probably. If you asked us 15 years ago, we would have said bad. Now," she gestured at the plaza, at the Solani moving through it with the easy comfort of people in a space that belonged to them. "Now we would say it depends on what question you're asking." Maddox filed that answer under the same category as 3's transmission about the directive. Things to pursue later. For now, he listened. Cale Doran was a good host in the specific way of someone who had hosted many difficult conversations and had learned that hospitality was the best environment for honesty. She walked them through the city's energy grid, transformed by Lathian mineral synthesis technology into something 3 times as efficient as what the Solani had built. She showed them the agricultural district, where yield per unit had doubled using Lathian soil analysis methodology. She brought them to the medical center, where 3 of the 5 diseases that had been endemic to Solen's southern hemisphere when the Lathians arrived had been effectively eliminated. Ham, walking just behind Maddox, said in an undertone, "This is exactly the deal they offered the Varani." "I know," Maddox said. "Technology exchange, medical protocols, navigation data." "I know. And they took it." "Yes. So what did they give up?" Maddox looked at Cale Doran, at her bioluminescent skin cycling through its amber warmth, at her easy manner, at the city around them that was genuinely, visibly thriving. "That," he said, "is the question, isn't it?" The reception that evening was everything that the word reception implied, and several things it didn't. The Solani were constitutionally hospitable in a way that made even the Varani look slightly reserved. They had prepared food from 3 different regional traditions, opened what Cale Doran described as our best vintage of Solani pressed fruit wine, which we think holds up well against Garanian, but we've never actually been able to do a side-by-side comparison, and invited a performance group whose music operated on harmonic frequencies the translation matrix couldn't process, but which Maddox felt somewhere in his sternum in a way that was not unpleasant. Cass, sitting very still in a corner, was pulsing a frequency that the collar device rendered as, "This is very loud. I am fine. Do not worry about me. I am absorbing data." Ham had found the Solani equivalent of a buffet, and had positioned himself near it with the territorial efficiency of a man who had learned that exploration sometimes meant not knowing when you'd next encounter good food. Yara was deep in conversation with one of Cale Doran's aides about navigation protocols, which was Yara's version of a party. Sable was doing what Sable did at receptions, which was talk to everyone and listen to more than she let on. Maddox was doing what Maddox did at receptions, which was enjoy them wholeheartedly while also watching the room. He was 3 glasses into the pressed fruit wine, which did hold up, he had to admit, though he wasn't going to give Garanian anything up without a fight, when he noticed the person watching them. Not openly. Not with the obvious attention of curiosity or suspicion. With the specific quality of someone who had trained themselves to look like they weren't watching while watching very carefully. They were Soleni, male, mid-height, standing near a decorative pillar with a glass in their hand that they had not touched in 40 minutes. Their bioluminescence was unusually muted, cycling low, controlled, the physical equivalent of keeping a neutral expression. Maddox looked away. He looked back casually several minutes later. The man had repositioned. Maddox set down his glass. He said loudly, "That hit the spot for me. See you in the morning, kids," and proceeded towards the accommodations Cale Doran so gracefully arranged for them. He noticed the mysterious man following him, then sat across the street for around 15 minutes until he was sure Maddox was in bed snoring. Maddox was indeed not snoring, but waiting for the man to leave, for which purpose he repositions his camera next to the window so he can see it on the small watch pad once the man gave up and left. He quickly got up and followed him down a multitude of narrow, hidden streets, and eventually to a building that looked, from the outside, like a maintenance substation for the city's power grid. Underground, it was considerably more than that. Facility beneath the maintenance substation was large, well lit, occupied by approximately 30 people or so, and had the specific organized tension of a place that had been doing something serious for a long time, and had gotten very good at not being found. Equipment covered every surface: communication arrays, data processing units, mapping displays that showed the Soleni system in extraordinary detail, including, Maddox noted, several areas that did not appear on the official city surveys. And on one of those mapping displays, cross-referenced and annotated, and clearly the product of coordinated intelligence gathering, was the Antaresar system. A woman stepped forward. She was Antaresar, unmistakably, the deep violet eyes, the elegance of posture, the expressiveness that in a Soleni facility, surrounded by people whose emotions moved across their skin in color, somehow looked even more restrained by comparison. She was not bioluminescent. She was very still. And she looked at the guy who followed Maddox. "Soren, did you find out anything?" Captain Maddox and his crew apparently were invited by the Soleni. They were given the grand tour and are now staying the night. Nothing happened beyond pleasantries. "I see," the Antaresar woman said. "We'll inform the cell about this new development. The rest of the resistance must know we cannot trust Captain Maddox." No response from Soren. "Go check on our guest, will you? Maybe he knows something about this new friendships in development." What guest, Maddox thought. The cell block was at the back of the facility, behind a corridor that smelled of recycled air and something chemical that Maddox's medical training identified as a strong sedative compound, airborne at low concentration. There were 3 cells, 2 empty, 1 not. Maddox kept his distance from Soren, but did manage to sneak quite ingeniously, he might add, around a corner, hidden in darkness from where he could see the occupant of the 3rd cell. The Lathian was tall, they were always tall, and was currently sitting against the wall with the specific quality of someone whose body was present and whose mind was somewhere considerably further away. His eyes were open but not focused. His skin, which should have been ash-gray, had the washed-out quality of prolonged chemical suppression. His head was bowed at an angle that suggested awareness was happening, but slowly, like a signal arriving through a lot of interference. On his neck, at the nape, the faint ridge of the lattice organ was visible, and around his wrists, attached to the wall, were restraints that appeared to have been designed specifically to prevent him from making contact with any surface with that ridge. Keeping him, Maddox realized with a cold clarity, physically isolated from anything that could serve as a convergence relay. His face, when Maddox could see it properly, had bruising along the jaw and the orbital ridge. Not recent, not old enough to have faded. Soren slammed the door behind him, the metal clanging like a death knell in the cramped interrogation room. The Lathian prisoner sat slumped in his chair, his iridescent eyes half-lidded, the faint glow of his lattice organ dulled by the sedatives pumping through his system. Soren cracked his knuckles, the sound sharp in the silence. "You're going to talk," Soren said, rolling up his sleeves. "You're going to tell us what the humans are doing here, what they want with the Solani, what they're really after." The Lathian blinked slowly, his voice a low, measured drawl. "It follows that your assumptions are based on incomplete data." Soren's fist connected with the Lathian's jaw. The prisoner's head snapped to the side, but his expression didn't change. No flinch, no grimace, just that same, infuriating calm. "You're going to talk," Soren repeated, grabbing the Lathian by the collar and yanking him forward. "Or I'm going to make sure you wish you had." The Lathian's head lolled back into place, his voice still maddeningly even. "The outcome requires further data. Your methods are inefficient." Soren hit him again, and again. The Lathian's skin split along his cheekbone, a thin trickle of dark, viscous blood sliding down his face. Still nothing, no reaction, no fear, just that same damnable indifference. Soren cursed, stepping back and wiping his knuckles on his pants. Useless piece of shit, he kicked the chair, sending it clattering into the wall. The Lathian didn't even bother to right himself, just sat there, staring at the floor like he was waiting for a bus. Soren stormed out, slamming the door so hard the entire facility shuddered. Maddox sat on the edge of his bunk in the Cashin's crew quarters, staring at the small device in his hand. It was a signal tracer, one of the few pieces of tech he'd managed to lift from the Solani facility before sneaking out and back to the Cashin. He'd seen the Lathian. Not just seen, recognized. The same species that had calmly dismantled an attacker in Corridor 7 while collecting data like it was a goddamn science experiment. The same species that had left him with more questions than answers after their little adventure in the Knot Nebula. And now one of them was being held prisoner by a resistance cell that seemed to think beating information out of a rock was a viable strategy. Maddox cursed under his breath, rubbing his face. He didn't like the Lathians. He didn't trust the Lathians. But he sure as hell didn't like the idea of them being tortured, either. Especially not when the resistance was getting Jack all out of it. He stood up, shoving the tracer into his pocket. "All right, you absolute unit," he muttered to himself. "Let's go break out a Lathian." The resistance facility was quieter at night, or what passed for night in an underground bunker on a planet with a 28-hour day cycle. Maddox had waited until the shift change, when the guards were groggy and the corridors were empty, before making his move. He disabled the first two guards with a well-placed stun pulse to the neck, non-lethal, but enough to drop them like rocks. The third guard, however, had been a problem. The Antarosaur was bigger than he looked. Maddox ducked under a wild swing, driving his elbow into the guard's ribs. The man grunted, stumbling back, but recovered faster than Maddox would have liked. He came back with a knife. Of course he had a knife, and Maddox barely managed to twist away, feeling the blade graze his side. "You're making this personal," Maddox gasped, pressing a hand to the shallow cut. "I just want to talk to your prisoner." The guard snarled something in his own language that the translator didn't bother with. Maddox didn't need it translated. The meaning was clear enough. Maddox feinted left, then drove his boot into the guard's knee. The man buckled, and Maddox followed up with a sharp uppercut that sent him crashing into the wall. He didn't wait to see if the guard stayed down. He didn't have time. He sprinted down the corridor, skidding to a stop outside the interrogation room. The door was locked, but the Resistance's security systems were a joke compared to the Cashin's. Maddox pulled out a small, multi-tool device, courtesy of Ham's questionable supply stash, and had the lock open in under 10 seconds. The Lathian was still sitting in the same position, his head lolling slightly as the drugs wore off. He looked up as Maddox burst in, his expression unreadable, his voice slow but clear. "This is unexpected." Getting the Lathian out of the cell was the straightforward part. He was cooperative in the loose, unfocused way of someone whose coordination was present, but whose decision-making had been chemically relocated somewhere else entirely. He stood when Maddox guided him to stand. He walked when Maddox indicated walking was the current activity. He said something in Lathic that Maddox's translation matrix rendered as, "The calculation is incomplete," which Maddox took as a reasonable description of the situation from any perspective. "Yeah," Maddox said, keeping his voice low and his hand on the Lathian's arm. "We're working on that. I'm Captain Maddox. I'm taking you somewhere better than this. That's the whole plan right now." The Lathian turned to look at him with the slow focus of a camera that had forgotten how to autofocus. "You are," he said, in heavily accented galactic common, "not Lathian." "Very much not," Maddox agreed. "You are the human." Maddox blinked. "One of them, yes. Have we met?" The Lathian said nothing further. His eyes drifted back to the middle distance. Getting out of the facility was considerably less straightforward. They made it to the first corridor junction before someone shouted. "Move," Maddox said, switching from guided walk to something more urgent, and to his genuine surprise, the Lathian moved, not with the fluid, deliberate grace Maddox associated with the species at full capacity, but with the specific purposeful quality of someone whose body remembered competence even when their mind was currently on holiday. They didn't make it far. The resistance had locked down the facility by the time Maddox and the Lathian reached the next corridor. Guards poured in from every direction, weapons drawn. Maddox shoved the Lathian behind him, raising his hands. All right, Maddox shouted. "Let's all just calm down." A stun bolt whizzed past his head, close enough to singe his hair. Maddox ducked, grabbing the Lathian's arm. Change of plans. He yanked the Lathian into a side corridor, barely avoiding another bolt. The Lathian started moving with surprising speed for someone who'd been drugged half to death, his long fingers gripping Maddox's arm as they ran. "Left," the Lathian said abruptly, pulling Maddox into a narrow maintenance tunnel. "You've been here before," Maddox said. "I have been observing," the Lathian corrected. "Your species' reliance on improvisation is—" Yeah, inefficient," Maddox snapped. "Just move." They steered into a stairwell, but the door at the top was locked. Maddox hit it with his shoulder, which accomplished nothing except hurting his shoulder, and then the Lathian reached past him and hit it with the flat of his palm in a specific spot, and the lock mechanism made a sound like a brief argument with itself and gave up. The door opened. Maddox stared at it for a half-second. "How did you do that?" "The lattice organ," the Lathian said while touching his nape, with the careful diction of someone choosing words from a catalogue that was currently only partially available. Interfaces with electronic systems at close range. "You've got to be kidding me." "That is extremely useful," Maddox said. "Can you do that to a security gate?" "Probably," the Lathian said, which was the most Lathian answer Maddox had ever received to a yes or no question, and he appreciated it enormously. The passage led to a small, circular chamber with a single, upward-sloping tunnel. Maddox could hear the distant hum of engines. "Is that—" "An emergency exit," the Lathian confirmed. "It leads to the surface." Maddox didn't wait for further explanation. He bolted up the tunnel, the Lathian close behind. They burst out into the cool night air, the facility's alarms still wailing behind them. Maddox's comms device crackled to life. "Captain," Yara's voice was sharp with relief. "We've been tracking your signal. Where the hell are you?" Maddox grinned, despite himself. "About to need a very quick pickup," he said, glancing at the Lathian. "And Yara?" "Yeah. We've got a guest." There was a beat of silence, then dry as dust. "Of course you do." Maddox laughed, already running toward the rendezvous point. Behind him, the Lathian moved with eerie, fluid grace. his iridescent eyes reflecting the dim light of Solen's twin moons. "You're welcome," Maddox called over his shoulder. The Lathian didn't respond, but for the first time, Maddox thought he saw something almost like amusement flicker across his face. The Cassion's shuttle bay doors hissed shut behind them, sealing out the chaos of the Resistance facility and the cool Soleny night. Maddox leaned against the wall, breathing hard, his side aching where the guard's knife had grazed him. The Lathian stood nearby, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, taking in the bay's interior with quiet assessment. Yara crossed her arms, glaring at Maddox. "You stole a Lathian." "I rescued a Lathian," Maddox corrected, grinning. "There's a difference." "There's really not," Yara said. "There's really not," Ham said, leaning against a crate with a smirk. "But I'll admit, it's a better story this way." Sable stepped forward, her amber eyes studying the Lathian with open curiosity. "You're injured," she said, her voice gentle. "We should tend to that." The Lathian looked at her, then at Maddox. "Your crew is." "Unconventional," the Lathian finished. Back aboard the Cassion, with the Lathian in the medical bay under Sable's careful attention, Maddox opened the channel to 3. The transmission delay was 3 minutes. The response came in 2.5. "Captain Maddox," 3's voice had, as always, the quality of something that had been at its destination before the journey started. "Your signal indicated an urgent communication." "Yes," Maddox said, "I have something of yours." A pause, a Lathian pause, the computational kind. "Explain." "I was on Solen for a first contact visit," Maddox said. "I discovered a resistance network operating from within the system, connected to the Antaresar resistance you may or may not know about. In their facility, I found a Lathian prisoner. Sedated, restrained, some signs of physical treatment I'm not going to describe in detail, because it'll make this conversation harder than it needs to be." The pause this time was different, not computational, something else. "A Lathian prisoner," 3 said, not a question. "He's in my medical bay," Maddox said. "He's coherent, the sedative is wearing off, Sable is with him." A pause. "He told me his name is 6. Silence. Lathian silence. The specific kind that 3 had never given him before, which was to say the kind that contained something Maddox's translation matrix couldn't classify and his own instincts filed under. "This matters more than I understood it would." 3, Maddox said quietly. "I need you to tell me about the Antaresar moon, not a data exchange, not a negotiation. I need you to tell me what your models say, because we are past the point where not saying it is the right call." A long pause. "The moon," 3 said, "will become structurally non-viable in 41 years at current extraction rates. Not 60, as the Antaresar engineers calculated. 41. His voice was flat and precise and contained, within its flatness and its precision, something that Maddox was only beginning to understand Lathians were capable of. "The directive's current assessment is that the moon's resource yield justifies completion of the extraction program. The structural outcome falls outside the current planning horizon." "Outside the planning horizon," Maddox said. "Meaning?" "Meaning it becomes someone else's calculation," 3 said. "In 41 years. Maddox sat with that for a moment. "Is that what you believe?" he said. "Not what the directive assessed, what you believe." The longest pause yet. "The Kethic Codex, our founding framework," 3 said, "identifies the permanent loss of a species' territorial foundation as a Varthanul-adjacent outcome, a scenario from which no viable future can be calculated." He paused again. "The directive's current assessment does not account for this classification." "So the directive is wrong," Maddox said. "The directive is working with an incomplete model," 3 said. "It follows that the output is incomplete." Maddox smiled despite himself. "I'm going to bring 6 to you," he said. "And when I do, I want to talk about what a complete model looks like. For the moon. For the resistance," For all of it. Captain Maddox, 3 said. Yeah. You removed a Lathium prisoner from a resistance facility, outran members of an active insurgent network, and are now proposing to use the rescued individual as the basis for a diplomatic renegotiation of a multi-system resource agreement. That's about right, Maddox said. A pause. In approximately what time frame, 3 said, does this become a formal ISV program initiative versus a decision made unilaterally by one captain on an exploratory vessel? Maddox looked at the ceiling of the Cashin's communications room. He thought about his father, who had worked 22 years in a shipping yard and had never been to space, and had made sure his son got there, and had sat at a kitchen table and cried without making a sound. Honestly, Maddox said, I'm not sure that line exists anymore. Another pause. Then, in a tone Maddox was still developing a complete category for something between assessment and the specific quality that a Lathian produced when they encountered a variable that refused to behave like a variable. No, 3 said. It follows that it probably doesn't. Set coordinates, Maddox said. We're coming to you. The channel closed. From the corridor outside the communications room, Ham's voice. Cap, the Lathian is awake, and Sable says he's asking for tea. Maddox blinked. Tea. Apparently 6 encountered it on a previous survey mission and considers it a viable thermal compound with an acceptable flavor profile. Sable's words, not mine. Maddox stood up. He looked at the closed channel display. He thought about 41 years and incomplete models, and the particular way a Lathian paused when something mattered more than they'd expected it to. Make him the tea, Maddox said. Already on, Ham said. I made enough for everyone. It's been a night. It really has, Maddox agreed, and went to find his crew. Personal log, Captain R. Maddox, ISV Cashin, Solen System outbound. The Soleni city of Vale is one of the most beautiful things I've seen in this part of the galaxy. It's thriving. The people are warm, the food is excellent, and Kale Doran is one of the more impressive administrators I've met anywhere. Underneath it, in a facility they don't know exists, a resistance network has been operating for years. 6 is in our medical bay. We don't know yet how he got taken by the resistance. He said his ship was attacked by an unknown vessel in Corridor 9. The same place the non-nebula incident happened, so it's pretty obvious what happened. The structure of their ship's hull, the Sever, was compromised. They were hit hard, and 6 lost consciousness. Next thing he knows, he woke up in the resistance cell. What we don't know is how he got there. 3 confirmed the Antares moon has 41 years, not 60. The directive knows. The directive has classified it as outside the current planning horizon. I don't know what I'm going to do about that yet. I know that I'm going to do something about it. I know that 3 is already calculating what the complete model looks like, and that this, too, is something. The Knot Nebula is still sitting in Corridor 9. Unexplained, much smaller in size now, it appears to be contracting. The Sever's node crew is unaccounted for, except for 6. What happened to the rest of them? The Unary Initiative has Lathian data we haven't fully decrypted. An unknown vessel with novel weapons is operating in this region, and I really need to get in touch to the ISV and try to explain why I'm having a Lathian in my medical bay drinking tea. I think my father would find this hilarious. I think he'd also be very proud. Maddox